which were the most important skills that you wanted your students to develop in this course? Could you give us an example of how you taught students these skills?
Okay, let me give you one of my favorite examples of this. So the first face-to-face session, I give them lots of evidence on, and it's very odd. It was based on, again, when I was developing the module, it was based on a Twitter thread, as it was then. And we looked at the role of feedback in scented candles. And it must have been the most, it's just the most weird start to it. So I showed them some statistics on how feedback on scented candles on Amazon changes over time. And the whole point of that was to encourage this sort of style of thinking. And again, it's applying that way of thinking. So not just telling them to think in this way, but to have that curiosity. And so I provide a number of different graphs and reports and information. And it turns out by the end that I'm looking at the evidence behind COVID and whether we can use things like scented candle reviews to determine early warnings for whether cases are about to rise in COVID, because often people will claim they can't smell it, but it's not necessarily because the product's faulty, it's because they've got COVID and perhaps haven't noticed. And so that for me was a really fun way of getting people to think about different things. So for example, why would the reviews of scented candles suddenly plummet? Why would that happen? And then obviously you build into the fact, okay, here's the years that it happened in, here's the time frames, and here's a little bit of the data. This didn't happen with unscented candles, so what might that tell us? And obviously trying to then eke into the details to encourage that. Have a look at the data on perfumes. There was no sex differences, for example, so what might that tell us? And kind of exploring those sorts of ideas. So could we find out sex differences in scent problems through COVID, through these sorts of reviews, and based on the fact that, for example, some perfumes are stylized towards men more than women. And so there was, again, it's those kind of creative ways to get people thinking. And I think doing that in the first session for me was a really fun one, because it just sets the bar. This is what is expected from this class, which is there's no silly questions, there's no silly answers. It's about facilitating. But I'll go back to your original question, because that was a little bit of a detour. Apologies. For me, there's a couple of things. The first of which is academic skills. So when we think about core academic skills, it's the things I've been talking about, just in different terms. So if I was to say critical reading and critical writing, something that's absolutely fundamental to any research degree, any taught masters, anything like that, that's absolutely fundamental. But the courses on that are so dry, they're so boring, and they don't really make any, people can't see how they relate to what's being asked to them from a course. Whereas I think embedding it in a course to develop those sorts of skills. So how do I read a journal article critically? How do I bring together different sources of evidence if they clearly contradict each other? I think that's quite hard. So those sorts of academic skills for me, I think, is a really important one. But again, it's also then the way of orientating that towards a practice. So, and I think about that explicitly, both in somebody's kind of day-to-day kind of roles, thinking about us all as future science consumers, right? Because we all, whether we like it or not, get told that scientists encourage us to do this, or scientists encourage us to do that in newspaper articles, things like that, or on the news. And then also that this is a really unique set of skills that if you really do hone, makes you incredibly employable. If you do have that ability to be able to evaluate lots of different types of evidence, think about how do they all fit together and try and make a decisive statement from these, even if they are inconsistent or contradictory or come from different kind of ways of thinking. That's a really, really important skill, particularly when we think about, for example, the increase of AI, which is capable of making more kind of formal links between obvious things. But this way of thinking is something that employers are going to be looking at. So for me, it's those combinations of skills. So it's broadly that critical thinking notion, but it's the academic skills, it's turning them into a practice skill so people are happy to and confident in applying them in practical contexts, and then thinking about how that relates to people's careers.